Shalom Aleichem, meine liebe Freund. Ich heiße Mottel Dittner und das ist 15 Minuten Yiddish. Mehr weniger. Jede Woche bringen wir euch eine Mini-Lektie in Jiddisch Sprach und Kultur von dem nationalen Jiddisch-Theater Volksbühne. Welcome back to 15-Minute Yiddish. If you missed any of our past episodes, daigenisht, you can view them all online at nytf.org/live. Today, we will unravel the mystery of Yiddish names. It all starts with Yichis, pedigree. We'll start with first names, der Nomen in the singular, die Nemen in the plural, to understand how we trace family lineage. Scott, sei es euch gut und erzähl uns wegen dein Nomen.
Okay, my first name is Scott, and my family's not Scottish or anything. I guess they just like the sound of the name. My Hebrew name is Shimon, and I'm named after my great-grandfather Semyon, who lived in Odessa, but he died before my mom moved here in the 90s.
Ausgezeichnet. That's exactly what I was looking for. So, if we go back 3 generations in Scott's family, we find a man living in the Soviet Union whose name was Semyon, which is the Russian equivalent of the Hebrew name Shimon. In Ashkenazi Hebrew, we would pronounce it Shimon. So, assuming that Scott's great-grandfather was named after one of his ancestors, the name Shimon has probably been in Scott's family for a very, very long time. The trend among modern Jews living in diaspora is to give their child a Hebrew name in accordance with this custom, as well as a name in a local language that might be an equivalent. For example, think of somebody whose name is Rebecca in English and Rivka in Hebrew. It could be a name that just starts with the same first letter. Think of Shimon and Scott. Sometimes there's no relationship whatsoever between the two names. You might know someone whose English name is Jill and her Hebrew name is Tzipporah. Before the 20th century, Jews did not typically have 2 different first names. Hebrew biblical names were the most common, but many people did not have Hebrew names at all, but rather Yiddish names that derived from Germanic, Slavic, or even Romance languages. Hirsch, as we saw recently, means deer. Wolf, or Velvel, means wolf. Berl is bear. Shendel is pretty. Bela, or Belka, is derived from a Slavic word meaning pale or white, the equivalent of blanche in French, blanche in English, bianca in Italian, or blanca in Spanish. Yentl comes from the Italian name gentile, meaning gentle, as in a noblewoman. Jente is an Italian name? Steich? Steich. Well, derived from an Italian name. The current understanding of a Yente has had quite a journey based on the fictional character named Yente Telebende, a busybody telephone operator, and later the character of Yente from Fiddler on the Roof. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, that just about covers the basics of first names. Now let's talk about last names. Auf Yiddish, der Familiennomen. Plural, die Familie nemen. Wayne, what's up with your last name anyway? I'm just Wayne. That's what I mean. Do you have a last name? Well, sure. I'm not weird or anything. I'm just a very private person. Like Wayne, up until the 18th or 19th century, most Jews didn't use last names either. It's not that they were private. They just didn't have them. In fact, most Europeans didn't have last names. Last names were first used by the nobility to establish their family lines, and there were some cultures, mostly in Western Europe, that were early adopters of last names, beginning in the 10th or 11th century. For religious and ceremonial purposes, such as being called up to read from der Teure, or for filling out legal documents such as die Kesube, a marriage contract, Hebrew patronymics were used. Most of us are familiar with this. Moshe ben Yosef, Esther Rochel bas Yisroel, una so weiter. Some Jews who were descended from the priestly class dating back to the times of the Great Temple retained the honorary title HaKohen, more commonly known these days as Cohen, and likewise descendants from the tribe of Levi would retain the honorary title HaLevi. For many, this would eventually become their family name. But prior to the 18th and 19th century, these would be used only for ceremonial purposes. And this left quite a problem of differentiating people in day-to-day life when your shtetl had more than one Menashe, or Leah. Which brings me to Murray. Sei so gut und erzähl uns wegen dein Familiennomen. Schwartz is the American way of saying schwarz, black. Indeed it is. There are several possible explanations for this name, but most probably it was used to describe somebody with dark hair, or eyes, or complexion. By the way, the Slavic equivalent would be Charny or Chorny. When you had more than one person with the same name, one of the ways that you can distinguish them is to physically describe them.
Hast du gehört wegen Mäuschen? Welcher Mäusche? Der Mäusche mit der weißer Bord? Nein, Mäusche mit der schwarzen Hue.
Another way to describe someone is in relation to another person. Hinde, do you remember what I told you about your last name way back at the end of season 1?
Oh, of course. My maiden name is Leibowitz, and my married name is Lefkowitz, meaning that both my husband and I had an ancestor named Leib.
That's right. The last name suffixes Ovitz, Ovich, and the anglicized Owitz are from Slavic patronymics, the equivalent of Ben or Bas, meaning child of, which is preceded by the father's first name. Leib's child, Leibovitz, anglicized to Leibowitz, and Lefkowitz is a variant. Lev is the Russian equivalent of Leib. It also means lion, and the V got softened to an F.
How did the K get into Lefkowitz?
Good question. That has to do with the Slavic diminutive. Your father's ancestor was probably called Levke. That covers the Slavic patronymics, now onto the German patronymics. Professor Thompson, was könnt ihr uns erzählen wegen euer Familiennomen? It's rather simple, just as it sounds, son of Thomas. Sehr, sehr gut. It works pretty much the same way in Yiddish. We often see these names anglicized, such as Jacobson or Nathanson. Originally it would have been Yankel's Zun, Nossen's Zun, und so weiter. And it wasn't always the father's last name that was used. Sometimes it was the mother's name. Think of last names such as Gittelson or Rachelson. And it isn't always Zun. Sometimes it's the neutral Kind, child of. And other times it was just the possessive. We see this in last names like Isaacs.
Und hat gesagt zu Surken. Welcher Surke? Surke Liebeskind? Nein, Surke Michels.
Sometimes we could distinguish people by their trade. Scott, let's talk about the first of your two last names.
Noodleman? Yeah, I looked it up in the Yiddish dictionary, but I couldn't find anything. I mean, I know it doesn't mean noodles like in Lukshin, although everybody at school thinks it does.
I'm guessing that you are looking to spell it with a Vov, like this. It's actually spelled with a Kometz Aleph, like this. In the dialect spoken in much of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Ukraine, a Kometz Aleph is pronounced as an U, the way that we would pronounce a Vov in the Klal or standardized dialect. What they pronounced as noodle, we would pronounce as nodl, the way that one would in Belarus or Lithuania. This means a needle. So, you most likely had an ancestor who was either a tailor or some allied trade, perhaps someone who sold needles to tailors. This is the basis for the very common last name Schneider. Often, a name that ends in man was used to describe someone who was a merchant of a specific product. Fischmann, someone who sold fish. Salzmann, someone who sold salt. Und so weiter.
Und sie hat sich abgegett von Feivelin. Welcher Feivel? Feivel der Malamid? Nein, Feivel der Schiester.
It wasn't until 1787 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and 1844 in the Russian Empire that Jews were legally required to choose last names so that families could be identified for the purposes of taxation, the military draft, legal proceedings, and other trappings of modernization. Some people simply chose the secondary name that was already used to distinguish them, so Moishe with the black hair may have had blonde children who kept the last name Schwarz, and 5 generations later you may have a doctor whose last name is Schneider. It is interesting to note that in the Russian language there is no soft H sound, only the equivalent of a ches or a chof. Russians tend to replace the soft H sound with a hard G. We can see this in many Yiddish names. Horowitz becomes Gorovitz, Hirsch becomes Giersch, and Cohen becomes Kagan or Kaganovich. A dank, Professor. During this time of compulsory family names, some Jews took last names based on where they were from. Sophia, was kannst du uns erzählen wegen dein Familiennamen?
Frankel? Ich weiß gar nicht wegen dem.
There are a few possibilities with this last name. One is that Sophia may have had an ancestor from the Franconia region of Germany, and the other is she may have had an ancestor von Frankreich.
But my family came from Poland, darling.
They may have ended up in Poland, but there were many waves of eastward Jewish migration as Jews faced expulsion and other forms of oppression in Western Europe, from the times of the Crusades, various plague outbreaks, and even Sephardic refugees from the Spanish Inquisition. So it's possible that they carried this geographic identifier for generations as a sort of unofficial last name. Many Jewish last names come from cities and regions. Warszawer, Warszawski, Warschauer, Warszawski, from Warsaw. Krakowski, Krakowski, Krakauer, from Krakow. Minsky or Minskov, from Minsk. Ostrow, Ostrov, Ostrov, Ostrovsky, Ostrowski, from Ostrov. Wilner or Wilner, from Vilna. Wiener, Wiener, or Weiner, from Vienna. Podolsky, from Podolsk. I could go on and on. This category constitutes lots and lots of Jewish last names, including my own. Scott, let's talk for a moment about your second last name.
Krumholtz? Oh, I know what that means. It means crooked wood.
Indeed it does. Krumm is an adjective meaning crooked or bent. Und das Holz means wood. A nicer way to translate it would be bent wood. Come to think of it, that's a great name for an English butler.
Ah, Bentwood, do be a good chap and draw me a bath.
When compelled to choose last names, many Jews simply made them up. And that leads us to verb time. Today's verb is oistrachten, to invent. We've already seen the stem verb trachten, to think. Oistrachten is a regular verb with a separable prefix. Let's take a look. Ich tracht ois. Du trachst ois. Sie, es tracht ois. Wir trachten ois. Ihr tracht ois. Zij trachten euch. Alle zusammen. Ich
Tracht euch.
Du
Tracht euch.
sie, es
Tracht euch.
mir
Trachten euch.
ihr
Tracht euch.
sie
Trachten euch.
sehr, sehr gut. In the past tense, euch trachten is an irregular verb. The GE or Gimel Ayin goes after the separable prefix. Wenn die Jiden haben euch getracht, ihre Familiennamen, a Sach von den Namen seien gekommen von der Natur, and very often these names were Germanized to make them sound more high class. We see this in last names containing the word Rosen. Rosen is Reusen. Rosenblum, a rose flower. Rosenthal, valley of roses. Rosenfeld, field of roses. Rosenberg, mountain of roses. A Sachnamen mit Berg. Eisenberg, iron mountain. Greenberg, green mountain. Goldberg, gold mountain. Precious metals were also quite popular. Silbermann is silverman. Goldstein, anglicized to Goldstein, goldstone. Stein, pronounced Stein in some dialects, means stone, often anglicized to Stein or Steen. We saw earlier that some names come to us from trees, also usually Germanized. Nussbaum, nut tree. Mandelbaum, almond tree. And some last names come to us from the animal kingdom. Lemoschel, Fuchs, is a fox. Adler is the Germanized version of Odler, meaning an eagle. And cats, of course, which could also be a shortened version of Katzenellenbogen, cat's elbow, named after a region in Prussia which took its name from a Germanic tribe that had nothing to do with cats or elbows. This just in. The Yiddish familionomen cats is not, I repeat, is not derived from the cute, cuddly family pet, but is rather an acronym of Kohen Tzaddik, a righteous member of the priestly class. Here to comment is Morris, the finicky cat. Hey, Mottle, didn't a lot of names get changed at Ellis Island? You know, the old Sean Ferguson joke? Not really. That's the stuff of legend. When our ancestors came here, they registered for the ship's manifests in Europe. At Ellis Island, they just matched up the disembarking passengers with the names in the manifest. Anglicization usually happened later and by the immigrants themselves as they assimilated. And since these family names had only been used for a few generations by then, there wasn't much attachment to them, and sometimes they were not just anglicized, but translated, so a Goldschmied became Goldsmith. And of course we know from many Hollywood tales that sometimes these names changed outright, and Iser Danielovich became Kirk Douglas. No, what's in a name? And now for story time. Again, we'll show it twice. The first time without translation, and the second time with. Scott, sei es euch gut und erzähl uns dein Meise.
In Mittelschule lerne ich sich in Spanisch. Ein Tag mit der Woche zurück bin ich gewesen sehr, sehr müde, weil ich bin nicht gegangen schlafen bis 2 Uhr in der Früh mit der Tag früher. Und zulieb dem bin ich geworden ziemlich den Kopf zwischen Spanisch und Jiddisch. Unser Lehrerke, Senora Morales, hat uns bewiesen Bilder von etlichen Menschen und die Studenten haben sie beschrieben. Ein Bild ist von einem Mädel. Ein Studentke in meiner Klasse hat gesagt, auf Spanisch, La chica es alta. Auf Spanisch, alta, meint hoch, aber ich hab das Wort gehört wie Jiddisch und ich hab gemeint, als sie hat gesagt, dass das Mädel ist ein Alte. Und trachten hab ich gesagt auf Jiddisch, nein, was bist du, Mischugge? Das Mädel ist sehr jung.
Let's watch that again with translations.
In Mittelschule lerne ich sich in Spanisch. Ein Tag mit der Woche zurück bin ich gewesen sehr müde, weil ich bin nicht gegangen schlafen bis 2 in der Früh mit der Tag früher. Und zulieb dem bin ich geworden ziemlich den Kopf zwischen Spanisch und Jiddisch. Unser Lehrerke, Senora Morales, hat uns bewiesen Bilder von etlichen Menschen und die Studenten haben sie beschrieben. Ein Bild ist von einem Mädel. Ein Studentke in meiner Klasse hat gesagt, auf Spanisch, La chica es alta. Auf Spanisch, alta meint hoch. Aber ich hab das Wort gehört wie Jiddisch und ich hab gemeint, als sie hat gesagt, dass das Mädel ist ein Alte. Und trachten hab ich gesagt auf Jiddisch, nein, was bist du, Mischugge? Das Mädel ist sehr jung.
Bravo, Scott. Please join us again next week as we discuss schlechte Sachen, bad things. And I'm going to ask all of you to be the teachers. Please think of one terrible thing and teach us all several related words. Sophia, sei so gut und erzähl uns am Meise dem kommenden Klass. Derweil, seid gesund alle.